Before we get started with today's podcast episode, I just want to take a minute to tell you about a free masterclass for dance teachers I have coming up soon. Training Turnout in Dancers is happening Sunday, May 4th at 10 a.m. Pacific. Turnout is one of the hallmark features of classical ballet and many other forms of dance, and dancers have long strived to achieve the elusive 180 degrees of quote-unquote perfect turnout. Although we know 180 degrees is often unrealistic, many dancers still strive to improve their turnout as much as possible. In this masterclass, you'll learn all about the anatomy of turnout, what the most common causes of limitations in turnout are, and how to address these limitations to help your dancers achieve their maximum turnout safely. I would love to have you join me on Sunday, May 4th. For more information and to save your free spot in the masterclass, go to www.allegro-performance.com/training-turnout. And now, here's today's episode. Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Dance Physio Podcast. I am your host, Erika Mayall. Before we dive into this week's podcast topic, all about turnout, this is your weekly reminder to make sure you are subscribed to the podcast wherever you are listening. And while you are there, leave a comment, leave a review. I would love to hear from you, love to know any thoughts you have about recent episodes. So go do that, then come back and keep listening. Like I said, today we are going to dive into talking about turnout and specifically a misconception that I think circulates within the dance world when it comes to understanding a little bit about turnout. And I posted about this on social media recently and got a lot of people commenting, or not even commenting, like sending me messages, DMing me about sort of like aha moments where they were like, oh, all of a sudden that makes a lot of sense to me in terms of what I feel in my body when it comes to turnout. And that misconception that we're going to dive into today is the idea that our turnout stays the same in all positions that we are moving into and out of as a dancer. And that is just simply not true. Our turnout varies fairly significantly sometimes, depending on whether it is a standing leg or whether it is a working leg or whether our leg is to the front or whether our leg is to the back or to the side or whether we're on a straight leg or whether our hip is in a bent position like a flexed or an abducted position. So our turnout can vary. And like I said, in some cases, significantly, depending on these positions. But I think within the dance world, there is this idea, and this probably stems from this previous ideal of people desiring to have that sort of quote unquote perfect 180 degrees of turnout. So there's this idea that we want to be like flat in turnout or have this 180 degree, and therefore that should translate into all positions in dance. And first of all, we know that 180 degrees of, sort of quote unquote ideal turnout just simply does not exist or is not realistic for the vast majority of dancers. And even the dancers who can achieve that in some positions likely cannot achieve that in a lot of other positions. And so I often get dancers who are coming into the clinic who are maybe a bit frustrated or feeling confused potentially about this because they'll say, what's a good example? Go into a grand plie in second position, let's say, because that's like often a very open position for our hips. They're like, I can get my knee so far back, I can get to like flat turnout in that position. But when I try and développé my leg devant or something along those lines, I can't access the same amount of turnout. And they, I think, immediately correlate that with some sort of a failure on their part, or, oh, I'm not doing it correctly, or I don't have the strength, or all of these different things about why maybe they can't achieve the same amount of turnout, when in reality, it may just be that we truly don't actually have the same amount of turnout in all positions that we are moving in and out of in dance. So turnout changes depending on what it is we're doing, what positions we're in, and how our legs are working. So that's kind of what I want to get into a little bit today. So we're going to talk about the reason for that variety in turnout in different positions, and then also what we can do about it to some degree. To some degree, as you'll find out, some amounts of this are fixed, but that doesn't mean that there aren't things that we can work on when it comes to turnout in terms of being able to accommodate or adapt to the fact that it does change in different positions. So just before we dive into sort of the variety of reasons why this happens, I want to give you a little bit of a visual, because sometimes people are a little bit confused about this concept of turnout changing in different positions. And one of the easiest examples, I think, of this that people will often understand, and one of the discussions that I often have with dance teachers about this, is the dancer who, say they're standing in first position or fifth position or whatever position they're standing in. We'll just say first because it's easy to visualize. But more often than not, when teachers are talking to me about this, the dancer is actually working from fifth position. But teachers will find that when they are standing, they maybe can't achieve huge amounts of turnout. So maybe this dancer has, and I'm just going to pull an arbitrary number out of a hat, but say if they're standing in first position, maybe they have about 140 degrees of turnout in that position. But as the dancer brings one leg up into a retire or a passe position or something like that, they're all of a sudden able to access more turnout in that leg. So as their foot slides up the side of their leg, they're able to push that knee further back. And so now that leg isn't necessarily so if they were standing at 140 degrees of turnout with both legs, let's call that 70 degrees on one side. Maybe now they can actually push that knee back and it's closer to 80 or 85 degrees. So it's starting to look more like that sort of like flat turnout or whatever you want to call it. But as they bring their leg back down, that leg turns back in. They can't maintain it. And this is often a question that I get from teachers or a discussion I have with teachers because they are often under the assumption that the dancer just simply lacks strength to be able to hold their turnout in their standing position. So, they can get their knees straight to the side when they're in a retire, therefore they should be able to get their feet straight to the side when they're standing with their feet on the ground. And that is simply not the case in a lot of instances because of what we're going to talk about now in some of the reasons that we see this variety in different positions. So that's just like a nice visual I want you to have in your head as we're talking about this. The other visual that I sometimes use is same idea. So dancer standing in first position, let's say, maybe 140 degrees of turnout between both legs. So by no means terrible turnout, but not a flat 180 degrees of turnout. And then they go into a grand plie and it's the same thing. All of a sudden, they can open their knees up more. They can access more turnout as they drop down into that grand plie. But as they come back up from the grand plie, they cannot maintain that. It all of a sudden closes back down. So it's the same idea. So whatever visual you want to have in your head, think about one of those kind of examples, and then we're going to talk about some of the reasons, and there are plenty of reasons why this happens, but some of the reasons why we see this variation. So one of the first reasons that we see these variations has to do with the bony architecture of, in this case, we're going to talk about the hip socket. Now, when we're talking about turnout, it does not just come from our hips, it comes from our kind of whole lower extremities, but the largest contributor to turnout is from our hips. So for the purposes of today, we're really just going to focus in on what's going on at the hip joint itself. And everybody has slightly different bony structure, bony architecture of this hip joint. So it is a ball and socket joint, and we've talked about that before on this podcast. And in fact, we've talked about it recently when we were talking about gripping at the hip with the mechanics of how the hip joint works. So most of you should know that it is a ball and socket joint. But not everybody's ball and socket joint looks exactly the same. So we have some people who have a much, much deeper socket, or some people who have a much more shallow socket, or some people whose hip sockets face a little bit more to the side, and some people whose hip sockets face a little bit more to the front. So there can be huge variety, and the variety in this bony architecture is not just to do with the hip socket itself. We also see variety in the angle of the femur. So that's our thigh bone, where the head of the femur inserts into the hip socket. We see variations in the angle of the neck of the femur. We see variations in the angle or the rotation in the shaft of the femur. And all of these things are going to influence how much turnout a dancer can access from their hip socket. And depending on what these bony structures look like and the actual shape of them, this is why we see some of this variety in the amount of turnout a dancer can access changing with certain positions. So in the example of a dancer coming from a standing position, like a first position, up into a passe or a retire position, we might find that when they're standing, maybe they have a slightly more anteriorly oriented hip socket. And so that's limiting their turnout potentially in their standing leg. But as that hip glides in the hip socket, or as the ball part of the ball and socket joint glides within the socket, it is going to be influenced by the angle of the neck of the femur and the angle of the shaft of the femur and all of those factors. And that is why they potentially may be able to access more turnout when their hip is in a flexed position, so the knee is coming up to the side, as opposed to when their hip is in a straight position, or we sometimes call this a neutral position in the physio world. So bony structure and bony architecture plays a big role. And so in this case, it's not simply the dancer not trying hard enough to hold their turnout, if that makes sense. You will often hear cueing where teachers, as a dancer's coming up into a retire or a passe and can get their knee more open, the teacher's really cueing them to keep it in that position as they bring their leg back down. Or the other example, going into the grand plie, you can open your knees a little bit more, and then it's like teachers are really like, keep that. Like they want dancers to be able to keep that same angle as they're coming back up into their extended position or their standing position. And although that cueing is not ill-intentioned, and yes, we want dancers to be trying to utilize the full extent of their turnout available, for a lot of dancers, the structure of their hip sockets is not going to allow them to maintain that exact same amount of turnout. And so the fact that they are losing some of that turnout just has to do with the shape of their bones, and not that they are not trying hard enough or not strong enough in those muscles, or whatever else reasons why teachers might think a dancer is not, I don't want to say like not working hard enough, because I feel like teachers don't necessarily jump to that conclusion, but sometimes there's maybe the underlying impression, or dancers might get that impression from their teacher, even if that is not what the teacher is necessarily thinking. But anyway, all of that to say that our bony structure will absolutely influence our turnout and potentially change it when we are in different positions. This also holds true for different amounts of turnout we might see with the leg going to the front versus to the side versus to the back, depending on the shape of the hip socket, the orientation of the hip socket, all of those factors we just talked about. Dancers may have very different amounts of turnout available to them in different positions. And so they may have loads of rotation available to them if they're going straight to the side, like an a la Sacan, but when their leg is behind them in a more arabesque position, they may not be able to access as much rotation in the hip joint in that position, or other variations of that. So we just need to understand that for some dancers, the amount of turnout they have is really going to vary in different positions. So bony architecture, bony structure is one thing that influences the turnout. The next thing that can influence this is the actual mechanics of the joint. And like I said, we have talked about this before a little bit. If you haven't listened to the podcast episode on gripping in the hip, it might be useful to go and listen to that podcast episode, just because, like I said, we did talk about the mechanics a little bit in terms of the glide that's happening in the hip, but depending on what movement we're going into at the hip joint, so whether it is flexion, whether it is abduction, whether it is external rotation combined with abduction or external rotation combined with extension, we have different joint glides that happen at the hip joint, different mechanics that happen. So whether that glide happens to go anteriorly, so forwards, or posteriorly, backwards, or inferiorly, we have different glides that are happening. And so the mechanics of the joint will influence how much turnout is available in different positions. This isn't something that you need to necessarily know like intimately. When physios do a lot of like manual therapy training and stuff, we spend a lot of time talking about like the individual joint glides at a joint and things like that. And I don't think it's necessarily something we need to get like really caught up on, but just understanding that the mechanics of the joint will influence the amount of turnout available in different positions is important, even if we don't need to get caught up in the details of exactly which glide goes with which exact movement. Sometimes though, if we have a dancer who, especially if they've had an injury in the past, but even sometimes if they haven't, if they're developing certain movement patterns or restrictions, maybe from overtraining or repetitive training or things like that, sometimes we actually do need to work on restoring the joint glide at the hip joint in order for them to be able to access turnout in a certain position. So if a dancer can maybe still access turnout in some positions, but on one particular position, like say going to the side, they're like, when I go to second, my hip feels like it's like restricted. I can't access my turnout. It feels like it's getting jammed or things like that. Then oftentimes we might look at the mechanics of the joint and think, okay, is there a glide at that joint that is maybe missing that we need to work on restoring in order for them to be able to access it? So although turnout does vary in different positions, if we see it kind of all of a sudden change and where one direction is really blocked or restricted, we might want to consider, okay, what's happening with the mechanics of the joint, because our bony architecture doesn't change all of a sudden. And so if somebody has previously maybe been able to access more turnout and now all of a sudden can't, we might be thinking a bit more like, okay, what's happened with the mechanics at that joint? And then the other thing, or another thing that can really influence the amount of turnout that we have available in different positions is how much tension we have in the soft tissues around the hip, and specifically in the muscular tissues and then in the ligaments surrounding the hip. So I'm going to start by talking about ligaments. The ligaments are soft tissues, they're connective tissues. They're not super elastic in structure. Ligaments have high collagen content, so they are strong, they are pliable, but they're not super elastic like muscles are. Ligaments are designed to provide structural support to our joints, and we've talked about this before on previous episodes a little bit in terms of if we've been talking about like flexibility and mobility and hypermobility and all of those types of things. But our ligaments provide structural support to our joints. In our hip, we have some really big ligaments, and they blend. In all of our joints, they sort of blend with the joint capsule, but particularly in the hip, the ligaments are quite big and quite robust around the joint, and they blend like entirely into this hip joint capsule. So it's almost like this little bag-like structure that surrounds the whole hip joint that's made up of this fibrous connective tissue to provide stability to that hip joint. Depending on what position we are in, so whether our hip is going into extension or whether it's going into flexion or whether it's going into abduction or whatever movement or plane of movement the hip joint is moving into, different ligaments tighten in different positions. So there's multiple ligaments around the hip joint. I'm not going to get into the specifics about naming all of them necessarily. If you're interested in that, you can certainly look that up like in an anatomy book or on Google. But those ligaments, depending on their orientation, so some of the ligaments are more at the top of the hip joint and some are more at the front of the hip joint and some are more at the back of the hip joint. And so they are going to tighten more or less in different positions. And that is their job. Like I said, their job is to provide stability in different positions. But depending on how tight those ligaments are or how much movement they are allowing or restricting, this may create different amounts of mobility into turnout in certain positions. what we sometimes see in dance populations, especially dancers who are participating in a lot of extreme stretching and extreme overstretching, and especially overstretching splits and things like that, is that some of the ligaments, and oftentimes the ligament in the front of the hip, will get overstretched and it'll start to lose its ability to provide support to the hip in certain positions in through there. And so we may actually start to, again, see very differences in the amount of turnout available in certain positions, and not because some directions are really restricted, but because other directions might be becoming hypermobile or too mobile if we're losing that structural integrity of the ligaments in the hips. So our ligaments are there for a reason. We need them. They're meant to be providing stability to the hip joint, but they are going to influence the amount of turnout available in different positions depending on which ligament is being tightened in which position. And so again, it's just something that we want to be aware of when we're looking at a dancer and kind of scratching our heads a bit thinking, okay, why can they do access these movements in this position, but they can't access these movements in other positions or what have you. So that's the ligament part of kind of tension we might see in some of these soft tissues. And then what we see much, much, much more commonly is varying tensions in the muscles or the musculature surrounding the hip itself. And especially in dancers, because we work so much in external rotation, and dancers really, really, really hate to go into internal rotation, or some dancers even don't like going into a neutral or a parallel, a true parallel position. We often develop a lot of really significant imbalances in the muscles around the hip, surrounding the hip joint. And that can create that tension that gets created from these imbalances of constantly being in an externally rotated position will often actually then limit turnout in other positions potentially. So certain movements or certain positions might be limited by tension that's being created in the muscular system. And so one of the things we want to make sure is that we are utilizing the hip through its full range of motion, and that includes going into turned in positions or internal rotation positions. And in dance, and especially forms that utilize a lot of turnout like ballet and other styles of dance like that, those movements aren't going to naturally happen in your class settings or in your training. You are going to have to intentionally add those movements in either warm-up programs or conditioning programs or cross-training programs or some other time outside of your actual dance training, because we don't use those positions in a lot of forms of dance. If you're participating in, forms of dance, say a hip hop or a contemporary or something, there might be more variety. There might be moments where you're going into more internal rotation and then moments where you're going into more external rotation. There might be more variety of movement, and we might see some of these imbalances develop less commonly, but certainly in more kind of Western classical styles like ballet or even jazz and things like that, when you spend so much time in turnout, you don't work the opposite movement. And so we get these imbalances in the tension in the musculature around the hips. So those, like I said, there's other causes for why we see variations in the amount of turnout available in different positions of the legs, but those are sort of the biggest ones that we want to consider. So the bony structure of the actual bones that make up the hip joint, the mechanics of how the joint is actually moving, and then how much tension we have in the soft tissues surrounding the joint. So all of those things are at play when we're looking at these variations in turnout mobility or turnout range. So what do we do about it? Why do we care? I shouldn't say why do we care, but what do we do about it? How do we address this? Well, I think the number one thing is to help dancers understand this. So whether you are a teacher or whether you yourself are a dancer, being able to understand this is hugely important for dancers to be able to then work with their body and not fight against their body. I cannot tell you the number of dancers who come into the clinic and, sort of sometimes it's the reason they're there and sometimes it's just offhanded comments that they make, but they'll often talk about like, oh, I have bad turnout. It's one of the things that bad turnout and bad feet are probably like the two things that dancers talk about the most in such a negative way. And they don't even think twice about it, I don't think. It's just this like accepted fact where they just come in and so matter-of-factly will be like, oh, I have bad turnout. When in reality, a lot of the times they actually have perfectly adequate turnout, and especially, in a lot of different positions and a lot of different movement patterns. But what they maybe don't understand is that their turnout is going to be different and is going to change. And so they will come in and be like, oh, I have bad turnout because when I stand in fifth position, I can't get my feet, facing sideways. But when you actually look at assessing their turnout and looking at different movements and different positions, maybe in that position, they don't have the most amount of turnout available just to do with the orientation of their hip socket or whatever it is. But as soon as they start moving, if it starts to be their working leg rather than their supporting leg, or as soon as they come up into hip flexion rather than being in like an extended hip position, or maybe as soon as their leg is going into an abducted position, they can actually access perfectly adequate turnout. But just because of the narrative in the dance world, they often label themselves as having like quote unquote bad turnout. So I think one of the biggest things is that we want dancers to understand that it is, well, the ideal should not be 180 degrees. And I do think a lot of dancers now are much more aware of that, but I still think that dancers don't have enough knowledge or awareness of the fact that we do expect turnout to be different in different positions of the legs or different movement patterns and things like that. So really just helping dancers understand, I think, is like one of the number one things we can do to address some of these negative emotions and negative thoughts that surround dancers when it comes to things like turnout. Then we want to look at maximizing our turnout in all of these different positions. And so sometimes this might look like strength training, but what I see so commonly is dancers come in and they have goals of improving their turnout, and you're like, okay, what are you doing? And they're doing like maybe the same 3 exercises continuously, and maybe there's some variation of a clamshell exercise or some variation of a retire exercise or something like that. And what I see often is that dancers are not necessarily training their turnout to account for all the different ways in which our turnout works. So we need to be thinking about, are we training turnout on a supporting leg or are we training turnout on a working leg? Are we training it on a bent knee versus on a straight knee? Is it our standing leg on a bent knee? Is it our standing leg on a straight knee? Is it a gesture leg with a bent knee? Is our leg going to the front? Is it going to the side? Is it going to the back? You can see all these variations, and we need to be specific about how we are training these, because lying on our side and doing 7 million clamshell exercises, so if we have our leg in a bent position and we're working just that amount of external rotation, does not necessarily translate to be able to access our turnout on a straight supporting leg in standing. It's just not the same thing. It's not directly transferable. And so we need to think about that when we're thinking about how we are training our turnout, to make sure that we are accounting for the fact that sometimes we're thinking about turnout in a working leg and sometimes we're thinking about turnout in a supporting leg. So making sure that we are maximizing the training that we are doing for different positions. We also need to think about, is this just a strength issue? Because I think so many times there's this, again, misconception that the only thing that we can do to help improve our turnout is work on strength, because, we can't change our bony anatomy and we can't change those types of things. And that's true. We're not going to change our bony anatomy necessarily. But like we just talked about, a lot of the variation or the restrictions we might see in turnout come from soft tissue tension or soft tissue limitations around the hip And so we can address those. So making sure that not only are we working on strengthening and training the turnout muscles to be working efficiently, but also working to address any restrictions that might be present so that we're not fighting against our own body. And especially in various positions, we see this a lot where dancers in a certain position might really be fighting against tension that is happening somewhere around the hip joint. So for example, one of the areas we really see a lot of tension is in the posterior hip, and especially like down lower in the posterior hip where the turnout muscles are. Like if you think of where your deep turnout muscles are, we'll see a ton of tension in that area. And if there is tension in that area, it often restricts a dancer's ability to be able to access their full turnout when they are doing anything with their leg devant. So especially like a développé, but even a kick or any sort of anything really with their leg to the front. And so simply by addressing some of that soft tissue restriction, we can often free up their turnout and they'll be able to access a lot more turnout with their leg to the front. That had nothing to do with, strengthening the leg in that position or what have you. So we definitely want to think about maximizing the turnout that we have available, whether that be through strengthening or whether that be through soft tissue work, and making sure that it is specific to how it is that we're utilizing our turnout. So like I was saying before, standing leg versus working leg, bent leg versus straight leg. You get the picture. And then the final thing that I think we need to think about in terms of understanding that our turnout is not always the same in all positions is teaching dancers how to, and I know that teachers are going to hate this word and I'm probably going to get some backlash against this, but teaching dancers how to sort of quote unquote cheat their turnout. And I do not mean forcing their turnout when I'm talking about this. So I just want to make that abundantly clear. I am absolutely not talking about dancers kind of forcing their turnout, over turning out, working like outside of their anatomical means. But what I mean, and this is especially for our older dancers, I'm certainly not going to be teaching this to like an 8-year-old, but once we have dancers who can understand this and conceptualize this a little bit more and feel it in their own body, is really teaching dancers to be able to feel when they can access more turnout and when they have to sort of like allow that turnout to maybe, what's the word I'm looking for? Not shrink, but return back to its sort of like previous state. So an example of this, just because we were using this example before, is in the idea of a grand plie. So if you have a little kid and when they're standing their first position, and I'll just keep using that idea of 140 degrees, if their first position is 140 degrees, if they're going to go into a grand plie, you're just going to teach them to go into a grand plie and maintain that 140 degrees. But if we have a dancer who we know because of the shape of their hip joint or any of the above things we talked about, if we know that they can access a lot more turnout as they get to the bottom of a grand plie because their hip's coming up into a more flexed position, we might teach those dancers to actually allow their knees to open up more so that they're utilizing that full turnout at the bottom, but knowing that as they come back up, their legs or their knees are going to have to like come back in a little bit. They're not going to be able to maintain. So let's just say, again, just for argument's sake of numbers, let's say when they get to the bottom of a grand plie, they can actually get their legs flat open to 180 degrees. So their knees are like directly sideways. We know if their standing turnout was only 140 degrees, that they aren't going to be able to maintain that 180 degrees as they return back to their upright position or they return back from their grand plie. So we need to teach dancers how to very subtly and artfully be able to sort of utilize some of these little cheats, but in a way that is not like aesthetically really obvious. And if you work with professional dancers or ever get the chance to watch like a company class with professional dancers or even dancers on stage, but specifically if you see them working in class and at the bar, you will see professional dancers do this so skillfully. If we look at dancers, and especially dancers who have, sort of self-professed that they have quote unquote bad turnout, you will see where they learn to maximize and utilize the most amount of turnout they have in certain positions, but when they return back to other positions, how they can
very skillfully kind of mask that. And sort of, like I said, I kind of use the word cheat. It's not cheating necessarily. It's really learning how to understand the mechanics of how your body is working and be able to utilize that or harness that to the best of your ability. But like I said, this is definitely for older dancers or maybe more skilled dancers, because you need to be able to do it in a way that kind of tricks the audience, and whether that audience is a judge or an examiner or just like a general population audience, we don't want it to be obvious that that is what the dancer is doing. But really, the more a dancer can understand their own anatomy and how all of the factors that are at play are affecting their turnout in different positions, the more they will be able to skillfully use these little cheats or hacks or whatever you want to call them to be able to have the illusion of maintaining, you know, as much turnout as possible, but without them forcing it in certain positions where their body may not be able to truly access it. So I hope I explained that well enough. Like I said, like I'm really not proposing that dancers be like forcing their turnout. That's absolutely not. It's like the exact opposite almost of that. It's dancers really understanding where their limitations might be and where they actually do have access to more turnout, and then being able to kind of exploit that or be able to showcase that. So hopefully that makes sense. I feel like I might get a bit of backlash for that, but that's fine. I'm always open to respectful and friendly conversations, but I hope that my kind of explanation of that is clear enough that you understand kind of what I'm coming at. I think I'm going to leave it there today. So if you have any questions, concerns, want to have any discussion about that, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm always happy to chat about that. But hopefully that gives you a little bit of a better understanding of why we see these variations in turnout in different positions, and especially in our dancers. And especially if you are a dance teacher, if you're sometimes puzzled why a dancer can maintain turnout in certain positions or with certain steps, and then in other areas or with other steps they seem to not be able to. This is maybe hopefully giving you a little bit of inside information about what might be going on in those dancers' bodies. If you are interested in learning more about this, I do have a webinar for dance teachers coming up on May 4th at 10 a.m. Pacific time. A recording will be sent out to everyone who is registered for it. It is called Training Turnout in Dancers. You can go to www.allegroperformance.com/training-turnout if you want to sign up for that. If you are listening to this podcast after May 4th, the recording of that webinar will be available on the website. So head to the website and check that out if you are interested in learning more about turnout. All right, that is all for me for today. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.